Good evening and welcome to Kingston WritersFest. My name is Barbara Bell and I'm Artistic Director of the festival. And I'm very, very pleased this evening to present Reaching for Hope, Transformation of a World in Peril, featuring Thomas Homer-Dixon. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land from which we're generating this online presentation is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their historical and ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All of those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. A few thank yous to give. We're so grateful to all of those organizations and individuals who support the festival. And in particular, Kingston WritersFest would like to thank Steve Iscoe and Jan Walter, author patrons of Thomas Homer-Dixon, and Blurred Words Book Club, author patrons of Ben Charland, Canada Council, Heritage Canada, Ontario Arts Council, the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council. And also special thanks to Tourism Kingston for their marketing support. And thank you, of course, to all of those who have donated to the festival. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping. The event is 45 minutes long, and we're going to pack it in, trust me. It will include a brief question and answer period toward the end. Tell us where you're from using the Zoom Q&A function, and then you can also post your questions for Thomas Homer-Dixon there. Complete our online survey for the chance to win a pass to next year's festival or a basket of books. Just check our website for details on that. We hope you'll tune in this week to our other great nonfiction free evening events, including the Robertson Davies Lecture, Black Lives Matter, delivered by Desmond Cole on Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And then The Big Idea, The End of Life as We Know It, moderated by Carol Off on Saturday evening at 7 Eastern Time. And now to the main event. I will very briefly introduce Ben, and then I will turn it over to him. Ben is a writer, a podcaster, and a creative consultant, and an enthusiast endowed with what you might call an unrelenting curiosity about everything. He hosts a weekly podcast, What on Earth is Going On, a show centered on genuine dialogue with people who think deeply and are keen to consider the big questions. Ben has interviewed some of the best minds out there, including festival alumni Rosemary Sullivan, Terry O'Reilly, Guy Gavriel Kay, Thomas King, Sally Armstrong, last night John Stackhouse, among many others. I highly recommend his engaging and wide-ranging podcast series, which you can find online at whatonearthisgoingon.ca. Ben is currently joining us from Whitehorse, where he's just as engaged as ever. Please welcome Ben Charland.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It's a real pleasure to be here, as always, with the Kingston WritersFest. This is my third event of the festival, and actually fifth event if you include the pre-festival events, and it has been fascinating from beginning to end, partly because of the questions that you guys provide in the audience. So if you have any questions throughout this conversation, as Barbara said, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom. You can type it in at any time during our conversation, and in the last 10 or so minutes, I'm going to go to those questions, pick a few out, and bring them over to Thomas. Thomas Homer-Dixon is who we're talking to today. He is one of the world's foremost thinkers about the multifaceted threats to our security and prosperity, and how we may or may not be equipped to face them. For over 3 decades, Thomas has taught and written about climate change, environmental degradation, nuclear weapons proliferation, the fraying of our social and political order, and yes, indeed, pandemics. If I start listing the books, articles, and academic positions that he has held at the universities of Waterloo, Toronto, and Royal Roads, we may never actually get to the conversation. So suffice it to say, Thomas has used his career to try to understand what is underneath the obvious, the worldviews, paradigms, and anxieties that undergird social upheaval, war, and the climate emergency, and the sometimes yawning gap between our capacity and our challenges. Now, that may not sound very hopeful to you, but in fact, Thomas has been called the Doommeister. Yet his latest book, Commanding Hope, The Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril, took him 8 years to write and is a chronicle of how we might just be able to meet this moment in time. Hope can be harnessed. The book is dedicated to his young children, so I guess it better be. Thomas, who goes by Tad, welcome to the 2020 Kingston Writers Fest.
Thank you, Ben. Oh, what a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that.
Oh, no problem.
Oh,
Tad,
I have to start my video, I see here. Hold on. There we go.
just as you start your video, I just want to say I'm really, really excited to chat with you today for many reasons. I've read your book, but I've read a couple of your other books as well, including The Ingenuity Gap and The Upside of Down. The way that you think about the world and what's happening, and like I said, what's underneath things, I think is an antidote to the sensationalism that we often experience in the media and even just in day-to-day conversation. And I think a conversation like this is really, really important. Now, to start us off, I was listening to the radio the other day, and I heard the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres speak. It was on September 21st at the 75th anniversary of the UN. He spoke of a surplus of challenges and a deficit of solutions. And I thought, Thomas Homer-Dixon should probably sue him, because that's exactly what you talk about, Tad, all the time. And you've enlivened this book with this concept of where we have solutions and where we have the challenges and where sometimes they meet and sometimes they don't. And then there's this theme of hope. But I was hoping you could speak to your career, before we get to this book in specific, speak to your career and how you've dealt with this surplus and deficit question really from the beginning.
That's a wonderful question, Ben. So ever since I was a kid growing up here on Vancouver Island, just recently my family and I moved back from Ontario to Vancouver Island the end of last year. I've been fascinated fundamentally by why people fight. What are the sources of conflict, of human conflict, especially the enormous conflicts and the really horrible ones that we've seen and know through history, the great world wars, genocide, and when I was younger, when I was doing my graduate work, I focused on the strategic arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. In those days, the Soviet Union still existed. What was it that was driving this dynamic? And I've spent a good deal of my career investigating that phenomenon, deeply the phenomenon of human conflict. And that's led me back to look at the precursors to conflict and some of the things that I see emerging on the horizon of our human circumstance that could produce much more conflict in the future. In the 1990s, I focused my own research and the research of a team of people at the University of Toronto on environmental sources of conflict, water scarcity, shortages of agricultural land, population growth, climate change, and how those things could combine in various ways to undermine and weaken societies and produce violence within societies and between societies. And then I went on with the book, The Ingenuity Gap, to look at how societies fail to solve their problems. Exactly the kind of gap that the UN Secretary General was referring to between the seriousness of our problems and our capacity to address them. Which societies are effective in addressing their problems, which aren't, which problems are particularly difficult. It turns out that climate change is an extraordinarily difficult one for humans to grapple with effectively. Again, the idea being that if we fail to address these problems, the ultimate result will be societal breakdown and massive violence. And I think that's a real prospect of this century. And in this current book, I'm trying to think through or identify a pathway forward, and especially the psychological relationship we should have to this very turbulent time that we live within. As you mentioned, I wrote it for my kids. And I realized around 2016 that as I was writing the book for the third time, because I had to start it 3 times, that it needed to be fundamentally about hope. That the thing that gave me the greatest anguish as a parent was the possibility that my children would lose hope when faced with all of these enormous challenges that are going to emerge and become much worse as they become adults. And I really concluded that that hope is the place where we need to start. It's a necessary condition, but it isn't, of course, sufficient for addressing these challenges. We need much more too. But without hope, we're lost.
I've actually got a quote from your book about that. And you say that the greatest danger is that we'll lose faith in our ability to create a positive future, and with it, much of our hope. Scarcity of hope could turn out to be the most crippling scarcity of all. And this is something that you talk about a lot, which is scarcity. But there's something else you mentioned just now, which is conflict. Now, there's a chapter of your book where you talk about the techno-optimists, such as Steven Pinker, who has written essentially over the last few years about how things are getting better. Calm down, everything is actually getting better if you look at it rationally with cold reason, which in some senses may be true, but what you say is that this is a sort of false hope, that he's giving us false hope because we're forgetting what's really happening. And in my estimation, partly from reading your book, but also just turning on the news and listening to what's happening in the world, conflict may be reduced in the interstate sort of conflict that we had in much of the 20th century, but there's a new conflict that's rearing its head, which is political polarization, where we don't view people on the opposite political party as opponents anymore. We view them as enemies. We view them as something to be defeated and destroyed, which is sensible why Donald Trump, if that is the philosophy, would today be saying that he doesn't know if he'll peacefully transition power because he doesn't believe the results will be fair. He believes that the other side, if they won, that would be worse than him remaining against the law. So there seems to be a conflict which we couldn't have predicted 20 years ago within ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of dehumanization, that rendering of other groups as beyond the boundary of our moral discourse, which is exactly what Donald Trump does, and which is a product of a lot of the polarization. Those of us who specialize in conflict would say that is a precursor psychological state to the worst kind of conflicts that we've seen in history: the genocides, the mass violence that occurs in world wars, for instance. There is a process at which people step across that threshold on both sides and render the other as if not inhuman, at least beyond moral discourse, no longer part of our moral community. So then we can destroy them at will. So this process that you're talking about, one of the things that scares those of us in the business so much is that it's a very significant stage towards the kind of truly horrific violence that we've seen in the past. So my response to people like Greg Easterbrook, Matt Ridley, Steven Pinker, and others, people I generally lump in this category of techno-optimist, is that they are correct in some important respects about the improvement of the human condition over the last 2 centuries, more specifically over the last half century. If you look at illness and disease, mortality rates, poverty levels, literacy, and even things like political freedoms around the world, there's been an extraordinary improvement, and also a decline in certain kinds of violence, especially the interstate violence that you're talking about, wars between countries. Less so if we look at the internal violence within countries. Many of those trends have gone in a good direction. So there have been improvements, declines in mortality, declines in sickness, declines in violence. However, the mistake these folks make is to assume that those trajectories of improvement that we've seen in the past are going to continue indefinitely into the future. They straight line extrapolate into the future. And the folks who are so worried about the state of the world nowadays, and that includes a lot of the people in the general public, aren't thinking so much about where they've come from. They're not saying, oh, we're so much better off than we used to be 50 years ago. They're looking out 20, 30, 40 years, or even 5 years in the future and saying, this doesn't look good at all. And because there is the sense that we've reached an inflection point in the species trajectory, and that we are at a cusp and we're starting to go down. And many of the indicators just in the last 4 or 5 years have actually started to turn substantially down. Many of them in terms of poverty levels, hunger, famines, and even violence, mass migrations have substantially worsened as a result of the pandemic. And it's not clear that everything's going to bounce back immediately after the pandemic when we're through this period of time. So this sense that we're at this cusp moment is very powerful, and I think it's real. And I think the evidence actually suggests that these optimists have given us a kind of false hope. And so this is where I come in as a complexity person, because I ground my work in complex systems science. And complex systems have this ability, whether we're talking about complex systems like the climate or an ecological system or an economy or the belief systems in our heads, they all have the ability to flip from one state to a quite radically different state very quickly. They go from one equilibrium to another equilibrium. We see this regularly. The pandemic is a great example. Within a period of a few weeks, 4 billion people on the planet were locked down. And there's this dramatic global change in human behavior. This very visceral experience of nonlinearity, of a flip from one state to another for all of us on the planet. So there's no reason to believe that the trajectory into the future for human beings is going to be, for our global civilization, is going to be a straight line. It's one way or the other, it's going to be characterized by these sharp, sudden jumps, because that's what complex systems do. And there's no reason to believe that if there are sharp, sudden jumps, they're going to be in the good direction, at least the way we're going. They may actually be in a highly negative direction. This is what these folks neglect to say, that human societies are nonlinear in their response. They don't always change incrementally over time. And the pressures are building up under the surface that suggests that we could actually see sharp changes in a very negative direction in coming years. So, you know, I have very strong disagreements with these folks ultimately. They're right about the past. They're probably wrong about the future.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, you talk about these techno-optimists and what they're saying, but a lot of it is banked on the use of the Earth's resources and the carrying capacity of the planet. This is something you've been involved with for a long, long time, the limits to growth study, which you talk about in this book, which take climate change and global warming, put that to the side, we still have a planet that has a carrying capacity. It can only support so much life, so much industry, so much development until it frankly starts to go down and those trends start to go down. Now, I think it's up for debate, as you say in the book, that we don't know if we're at that exact point in the terms of the carrying capacity because it is such a complex system. We can't predict what exactly will happen. But when we talk about climate change and we talk about simply the ability of this planet to sustain us, there's no question that there must be a point down the road where that would happen. Where we
I think we're probably at that point or even past it now. So these, sorry to interrupt, but these techno-optimists are, they presume that we can substitute human intelligence and human ingenuity infinitely for resources. So if we run out of this stuff, we can just be brilliant enough to invent new technologies or substitute resources. And in that section of the book you were talking about, where I discussed the limits to growth study, I point out that when it comes to non-renewables, so the limits to growth people back in the 1970s thought that the stuff that was going to constrain human growth was going to be the non-renewables, the iron ore, the copper, the oil, the stuff that's not renewed by natural processes over time. It's just in the ground, you use it up, it's gone. And they would say, okay, it's finite, and that means when we run out, and it's going to be terrible. Turns out that human beings actually are very good at finding substitutes for that stuff. But it's the renewable resources, the ecological systems, the forests, the climate, the things that would seem in some sense to be infinitely available if they're well managed, that they turn out to be much more vulnerable to the damage we create. It's those things that turn out to be really scarce. The capacity of the atmosphere to absorb carbon dioxide is actually very limited. And if we exceed it, it does enormous damage, not just to the climate, but to water systems and forests and food production around the world. It has all of these kind of ramifying effects, branching effects through other systems. And it's that stuff that, again, these folks, and here's the key point, because those systems are so much more complex, the amount of ingenuity, the amount of intelligence that we have to respond with to deal with problems and scarcities in those resource systems is vastly larger than when it comes to something like oil or iron ore. And in many cases, it seems like we just aren't able to deliver those solutions. when and where we need them. We just aren't. And again, these folks, yeah, we're really smart. Human beings are incredibly creative, but it's not clear we're creative enough to solve the problems we're creating for ourselves now. Not at least when it comes to that kind of resource, the renewable resources, the complex resources around us.
So I'm hoping that our conversation today, Tad, can kind of mirror what it does in the way that we're getting close now to the depths of despair and how, as sometimes people say, I hope from this point we can lift off with hope. But I just want to read you something. I got to chapter 3 of your book, and this is what I wrote as a note to myself. And I wrote, despite all this talk about hope, this book is F-U-C-K-I-N-G horrifying. And then that was only chapter 3, though. We still had, I think, 15 chapters to go, 20 chapters to go. So it got, I don't want to say it got better. It just got more hopeful.
No, it actually gets worse after that. It keeps
does.
going down. So there is this nadir around chapter 9. And then as you point out, it comes up again.
But here's what I really appreciated is that you actually analyze hope and what hope means, where it comes from, what the different kinds of hope are, and how we can harness hope. So can you just take a moment to tell us what this word means and what it could mean?
Sure. So hope gets kind of it gets a bad rap in popular discourse right at the moment. You know, people think that it's a rather passive emotion. Perhaps it leads us astray. It's inclined to be false because it encourages us to engage in wishful thinking. And as I said at the beginning, I decided that you know, the thing that would give me the most anguish is my children losing hope. So my starting point was how can we take this idea, reinvent it, and reimagine it in a way that would allow us to push through our hardships and to find solutions to these challenges that we face. So I developed this idea of what I call commanding hope. And the double entendre is quite intentional. It commands our attention because it's a powerful idea, but it's also a reflection of our ability to actually take charge of hope and make it something that works for us very effectively. And it has 3 components: honest, astute, and powerful hope. And one of the reasons this book has this kind of emotional trajectory of going down to a dip and then coming up again is I actually spend a fair amount of the book talking about the tension between honesty and hope. Taking seriously our problems means that we have to grapple with the science and recognize the constraints we're going to face in the future as a society, as a species. And that can be tough on our hope. But the starting point for this commanding hope, this notion of commanding hope, is a realistic understanding of the challenges we face, not fooling ourselves. So I spend, as you know, towards the middle of the book, I actually do a quite compressed account of just how serious our situation is. And that gives us a sense for what the boundaries of possibility are going into the future. That we're going to have to work within certain constraints, like a warmer planet, declining biodiversity. Even if we do very well, some of those things are going to happen. But that's the starting point. Then there's this idea. Okay, we want to have the possibility of improving our situation. One of the tools we need is a better understanding of ourselves and other groups out there with whom we can work to try to address these problems. This is what I call astute hope. And as you know, I provide a number of tools and devices within the book that allow people to come to a better understanding of how other people see the world, so that we can potentially work together to address the problems we face. Or if other groups are implacable opponents, and we recognize that, we can strategically work around them in our political contest with them more effectively. And then the last part of this idea of hope is what I call powerful hope. And this is a hope that has a very clear sense of where we want to go. So my hope, commanding hope, has an object. Hope doesn't need to have an object. It doesn't need to have a vision of the future, even roughly sketched out. It can just be a general feeling of hopefulness. But I argue that's a very weak kind of hope. So instead, I argue for what I call hope to produce a world that is beneficial, and we have a clear idea of what that is. I developed that vision of the future in the last part of the book. And I argue against a more passive notion of hope that we hope that things will come to pass. Instead, we need to actually act as agents to get us to that vision of the future. So powerful hope has that vision, and it actively engages us in getting to that better possible world that we've defined for ourselves. So these three things, honest hope is a moral stance. It's an attitude towards truth. Astute hope is an epistemological stance. It's an attitude towards knowledge, the kind of knowledge we need to justify our hope. And then powerful hope is a psychological attitude or stance. So it's a sense of agency and possibility that allows us to push forward even in difficult times. And those three things together make up commanding hope. And that's the way I try to reinvent this in mode that we can use it more effectively in these tough times.
Ways, Ted, I think in your book, especially in the second half, where you talk about harnessing and commanding hope, as you say, is talking about worldviews, technologies, institutions, the WTIs of your book, and how if we want to have this cascading effect, this cascading virtuous circle as opposed to a vicious circle, we need to change the worldviews that we hold. And perhaps, and at one point you say this may be the critical piece of the book, to change what we is.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Not to change who we are, but to change how we identify as we. So is we our tribe, our community, our city, our country, or is it all of us together? And until we have this all-encompassing we, it really doesn't matter what our worldview is other than that, because we're neglecting the fact that this requires all of us to work together and all of us to command this hope. But that's where your complex and complexity and complex systems thinking gets really exciting and interesting in that latter half of the book, where you talk about the systems of the mind, and actually you talk about the mindscape, all of the possible ideologies that we might have in the world. And I wondered, as I was reading that, if you felt that was the way forward. If the way forward is for us to really analyze how we're thinking, be empathetic to the other side, almost like playing a game of chess. If we have these implacable opponents, well, how do we work around them? How do we almost do a sort of jujitsu? And how do we predict their next move? And I just wondered, is it, and there are leverage points that you talk about as well, is this how we do it? Is it purely in the state of mind, or is it more concrete than that? Or yeah.
But yeah, so it's a starting point, and it's only a starting point. So you mentioned this WIT approach, worldviews, institutions, technologies. This is based on some research that came out of Columbia University back in around 2009. In my research team at the University of Waterloo and at Royal Roads University, we use what we call a Wit Framework, worldviews, institutions, and technologies. And the idea is that these three things are very tightly coupled together, and you kind of need to change them simultaneously because they reinforce each other. But then the question then becomes, a quite reasonable question, is where do you start? Where do you enter into this circle? And you know, this is after decades of thought, I decided that the intervention point, the best starting place, is with what's going on in our heads. How we think about the world, better understanding how we construct our own worldviews, and then using that and using the same tools to understand better how other people see the world, their own worldviews. And I provide, as you know, a couple of very specific tools. Cognitive affective mapping, and another one called the state space model, and I explain them in a bit of detail in the book. And anybody can use these to think about how they are seeing the world, understand themselves better as well as other people. And you put it very nicely. It allows you, when you have these devices, to work more effectively, I believe, with other people, and also to be more strategic in your dealing with those folks whom perhaps you can't agree with. One thing I've found, and for me this has been very powerful, to develop these tools and use them, I may vociferously, vehemently disagree with, say, climate deniers or our folks who are my opponents in some of these conversations about the critical problems in our world. But with these tools, I'm very angry. I understand where they're coming from. I understand that they're expressing their own humanness and their own deep desires and anxieties through a particular worldview that they're clinging onto very carefully and very, very adamantly in order to protect themselves from those anxieties. And frankly, as you know, in the book, I talk about how I'm doing it myself. And that very realization makes ultimately, I think, can make us much more effective actors politically. But it's ultimately a political project. The worldview change stuff is just a starting point. You have to go after those institutions. You have to change the technologies too. And that requires political mobilization. So I see the worldview, engagement and understanding with worldviews as the starting point of a political process, bringing very large numbers of people together, flipping attitudes in new directions, and using that as that political power to actually change the hardware of our societies, which includes the institutions and technologies. Now, I have this story of an individual in the book, Stephanie May, who actually engaged in this kind of personal project in her action to stop testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere in the 1950s and 1960s. So I show that there is somebody who can actually, there's an example of how this is done, and I'm hoping that we'll see much more of that in the future, of course, because we face equally serious challenges now.
Well, and actually, Stephanie May is the mother of the former leader now of the Green Party, Elizabeth.
Yes. Erstwhile leader.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
And has a fascinating story that you weave through the book from beginning to end, and constantly return to the story of moral heroism in the face of what must have looked like in the 1950s as impossible.
Absolutely.
To stop nuclear weapons testing at that time was not only seen as unpatriotic, but seen as, just by any scholar of the time, that's not going to happen. These two imperial powers need to continue doing this to win the fight. And yet it succeeded in the end. And there was not only a moratorium, but test ban treaties. We don't know where those are going to go today. But one thing that she does that you also show yourself capable of doing in the book is a mind transplant, to actually go over to the other side and pretend as if I have these beliefs for a while. What if I thought the opposite as I do? And it was interesting because it almost got quite personal, where you talked about you had to really see the world in a different way, and your beliefs had to be upended, and the way that you associated with your children and your whole life and your career was an interesting moment for me in reading the book. And I wondered if that was that in the first, second, or third writing of the book that happened for you?
I wrote that part. There are two thought experiments that I run, as you know. And one of them involves taking a deep belief I have, in this case, that climate change is a really serious problem, and simply telling myself, or what are going to be the implications in my mind if I simply flip that belief on its head. All of a sudden, I'm told tomorrow irrefutably that climate change is not a problem. It's just not.
Right.
How does that affect me? And it turns out it's much more complicated than I suggest than one would immediately think. Of course, there's an enormous sense of relief, especially for my children, a huge sense of relief. But there are other things. I built my hero projects around this problem. I have a deep engagement, personal engagement, in terms of the meaning of my life with stopping climate change. And I suggest to the reader, after I walk through this thought experiment, that it's very useful to take a belief that you're profoundly committed to, and see what happens to your worldview if you tell yourself you're wrong. It's a really wrenching experience. Now, that doesn't mean you have to sit there and stay in that particular worldview, but we need to cultivate, just like Stephanie May did, cultivate the ability to kind of alt flips, to step into other worlds. Because one of the things that's really cool about our social reality is that we can collectively reinvent our social reality if we think about things differently. So we need to get better at thinking about things differently, even if it means sometimes we have to think about the things the way our opponents do to understand how they see the world better.
Right. I forget now who said it, but wisdom is the ability to entertain a thought without accepting it, and to have that meditative process to, well, what would it be like to think on the other side of it? There's one question in your state space questionnaire. I did the questionnaire. I saw in the later part of the book that you showed two different versions of the answers to the questionnaire. So I pretended I didn't see it, went back and completed the questionnaire myself. And one question that really made me think deeply was, do you accept or resist authority? And this is a really tricky question, because if we're going to stop climate change, or at least combat it, or adapt ourselves efficiently and effectively to do so, if there's one beautiful quote in the book where you talk about, which isn't you that says it, but you quote someone else saying, if you put the pebble in the river at just the right spot, you can change the course of that entire flow of water.
Yeah, that's Philip Pullman from the Dark Materials trilogy. Just wonderful. Yeah.
Right. And you also talk about the Lord of the Rings in the book, which wasn't something that you were necessarily interested in, but got interested in with your kids. And this idea that we can actually change the whole world with one small action, with one, if it's the right action. But this was interesting to me because in my mind, if we're going to solve or confront the issues of climate change, populism, environmental degradation, whatsoever, we need to turn to authority, and we need to turn to a massive scale mobilization unlike anything we've seen since the Second World War, or perhaps this pandemic. That, though, requires a certain submission to authority. Yeah. And I wonder then how we grapple with this idea of authoritarianism today, because authoritarians today are not really accepting climate change, but when they do, they may say, I'm the only chance you've got. Yeah. I will run everything and tell you what to do, and I will solve this problem for you. And hey, you can do it democratically, but it's never going to work. And so this presents a real problem, I think, this idea of authoritarianism, because it will present a solution that is attractive to a lot of people.
Yeah, so you put your finger on one of the critical nubs of our problem, right? So it's not actually the case that all authoritarians don't accept climate change. There's an elite in China, a good chunk of the world's population, that definitely accepts climate change. And one of the things we've learned from the pandemic, which is actually quite scary and we need to reflect on a lot in Western societies, is that China has crushed the virus. You know, its economy is growing again. And Western societies are all over, with very few exceptions, they've made a real mess of this. And you know, to get back to your point about authority, what scares so many people about the climate problem is its implications for government regulation and intervention in our lives. Because as you've pointed out, it's very difficult to think how we're going to solve this problem without more government intervention and regulation. Now, given my political persuasion, I'm not terribly alarmed by that. But there are a lot of folks out there who quite legitimately are really alarmed by that. It's, you know, the dead hand of government, the dead hand of the state. It's everything that they dread because they are deeply committed to principles of liberty and personal freedom, and they may be entrepreneurs, they have a kind of exuberance about life that regulation and government interventions by the state crush. So they've got, in my state-based questions, in that questionnaire you're talking about, these folks are very committed to the principle of agency and free will. And we can't just say they're wrong. Instead, we have to figure out a way of reaching some kind of compact or understanding that allows them to see a possibility in the future for solving climate change in which they can thrive, right? And that's part of powerful hope, is creating a vision of the future that allows for those folks who make up a very substantial fraction of any society to feel that they can flourish with their exuberance in that future. And so this is very hard because, okay, how do you deal with climate change without the heavy hand of the state? And China is perhaps one of the only actors in the world that has the capacity to redirect the entire economy, this massive economy, because there's so much top-down authority in it, to build out the renewable power, to deploy electric vehicles across the country, to shut down the coal plants, which of course they haven't done entirely. But they have that command and control capacity where our other economies don't. And there's enormous resistance, psychological resistance within Western society to that kind of ferocious regulation too. I don't have a clear answer to this question, but the starting point has to be a recognition that the folks who are resisting knowledge about climate change and resisting policy action on climate change aren't crazy, and they aren't malicious, they aren't evil, but they are coming from a perspective on what makes their lives meaningful that's very different from ours. And they need to be on board, because if they're not on board, we can't solve this problem. If we keep yelling at each other, we're not going to solve this problem. Absolutely.
Oh, and this is the dilemma I face when I answer that question. I think of China as the first thing I think of, because they're posing the question to us now. Doesn't look, essentially what China is saying in global politics is, your system of liberal democracy isn't working too well for you, is it? Well, look what we're doing. And
Yeah, and
that,
I'm not prepared to say that. As you know, I come vociferously to the defense of democracy in a number of places in the book. But there are a couple of really profound challenges we face as a species. One is trying to figure out how to get beyond our particular model of economic growth at the moment, and I spent quite a bit of time talking about that. And another is developing new models of democracy that are real democracies, that aren't susceptible to the kind of failures that we're seeing in multiple ways in our current democracies. Our inability to solve critical long-term problems, our inability to create a sense of community around problems like the pandemic, and the increasingly profound polarization, social polarization within our societies, aided and abetted by social media technologies. These are becoming they're more than Achilles' heels for us. They could destroy, in the process of destroying American democracy at this point, the incapacity to effectively deal with the challenges that the society faces and the deepening polarization. So I don't want to say that China's got the answer. I don't think China has the answer. There are all kinds of failures there too, but something's not working here in the way we are within our democracies. We have 18th century democracies that are trying to deal with 21st century problems, and that's an ingenuity gap. We haven't figured out how to close it.
well, it's interesting. In the early part of the 20th century, many liberal democracies shifted and became more generous in terms of public services and so forth, in reaction to communism, in reaction to the rise of Soviet socialism, in a way to say, okay, we're going to have to provide some of this stuff, or they're going to win the argument. Perhaps the same thing may happen with the argument from China today. But we've only got a few minutes left. I want to turn it to some questions from the audience. Barbara Bell, our artistic director, asks about language, which I think is so important as we talk about our democracy, which is so founded on principles of shared language and shared understanding. She asks, how important is using this language, adjusting what we say from "I feel hopeless" to "I hope that" to "I hope too"? I mean, can this make a difference, is what she's asking.
Yeah, so I'm not a strong proponent, but at least something of an advocate of the Benjamin Whorf hypothesis, the old Whorfian hypothesis, that language actually does influence the way we think. I can get more sophisticated about it than that simple statement, but I actually think that the shift from hope that to hope to is significant. We need to make agency part of hope. It has to be there from the start. And I think one of the reasons we regard hope as a passive emotion is that we tend to think of it in that very passive hope that sort of way. Well, I hope that a nice future comes to pass. We haven't got time for that anymore. And so right from the beginning, I say, just like Stephanie May did, let's put ourselves in this process and act to change things. And it doesn't require a enormous sense of confidence that positive future is going to come to pass. You can have a very powerful sense of hope, even if you think that object of your hope, that positive future, is much less than, say, even probability likely to happen. I have an interesting experience with some of the people I talk to, young people I talk to, when they ask me, so what's your estimate of the probability that things will turn out okay, that we will have a just and humane society, say, a century from now on the planet? And I say, well, maybe 20%. And they say, okay, that's fine. 20% is all we need. Let's get going. Let's solve the problems. People don't need to have a strong sense of confidence the future that they want will come to pass. They just need to know that it's possible. And I think it's still very much possible.
Tad, I want to bring a question in here about federal politics. So prepare yourself. This is from Yvonne Hiemstra, who asks, in view of the throne speech, how optimistic are you feeling about our government's plans? I guess this is in climate change or many of the subjects that we've been discussing.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So it's very clear that the Liberals decided to retreat from their grand plans for a green recovery. I think they were getting from polling and other data, and they anticipated a series of possible attacks from the opposition. They were getting the sense that the Canadian public wants to focus on the pandemic right now. And I think probably the public health officials were saying that the pandemic was about to explode again, and we're seeing that across the country. I think that strategically, that was probably a fairly smart thing. It's just, I don't think ultimately that the Liberals are retreating from their broader agenda for investment in a greener Canada, but they've decided to sort of back a burner that and front burner the plans for dealing with this next wave of the pandemic. I can understand that, but we have this larger problem, and it's not just for Canada, but it's for the whole species, that we haven't figured out how to structure our society, our economies, in a way that dramatically lowers our greenhouse gas outputs. We've been talking for decades about this climate problem. And if you look at the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's still just increasing on almost exactly the same trajectory it has for decades previously. So there are some really profound issues about how we have a reasonable distribution of wealth within our economies, while at the same time reducing the kind of economic growth that requires enormous quantities of pollution to be shoved out into the natural environment. And I don't think anything that the Liberals are proposing right at the moment with their green retrofits and their EV charging stations and anything really comes to grips with that underlying set of challenges. Although, frankly, there's not a single regime in the world that is at the moment. And that's one of those two really big questions that I was talking about before.
Well, yeah, and this is what comes up in the opening chapters of your book, is that we're addicted to growth, and we've been addicted to growth for a long time. And not only how do we get over that institutionally, but how do we get over that in terms of our worldview? It seems to require a complete paradigm shift to move to some kind of society, or thinking about our society, where we don't have to grow 2.5% every year in order to just keep, it's like riding a bicycle. If we slow down, we're going to fall off. And that's not sustainable. Yeah.
And the tricky part of it is that, about half the world's population actually needs growth desperately, because they don't even have the basics of what Canadians regard as their almost rightful entitlement in terms of education, food availability, shelter, things that give human beings very basic security. Almost half the world's population is still living on less than $5 a day income. And they desperately need growth. So they can throw up their hands and say, what are you talking about, no growth? And yet the kind of growth we have is destroying the planet, destroying the envelope within which we live. This is one of the most profound conundrums we face right now.
Yeah, it's a whether you like it or not problem. This is what's happening. Yeah. I've got a question here. It's the second to last one from Harriet Waterman from Kingston, who asks, why is it so difficult? And we've addressed this already, but maybe in a more succinct way, why is it so difficult for people to understand the realities of climate change? Is it denial, or what is it that makes it so hard?
It's just to put in really one sentence what I was saying before, the implications of climate change are profoundly distressing for people who are opposed to government regulation and the increasing authority and role of government in our lives. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that when a problem of any kind challenges the fundamental principles of your worldview, you're going to be very inclined to believe that the problem is just not real, right? Because the alternative is to accept the problem and give up your worldview. And that leaves you enormously vulnerable to a whole series of critical anxieties. So I talk about the fact that our worldviews protect us from our fear of death. And it's one of the most profound fears that we all have, death anxiety. And we develop various hero stories and hero projects in our lives to give us a sense of immortality that will extend our existence beyond our physical existence. We raise a family, we write a book, we build a business, we're a really good friend or community member. All of those things allow us to to buffer ourselves. And one of the critical parts of that buffering is our worldview. And climate change just profoundly threatens the worldview of a lot of people. So they, you know, for a lot of them, the easiest thing to do is just deny the reality of climate change. And they've been able to get away with it for a while because it's always been off in the future. It hasn't seemed too bad, but now we're starting to see the results, and it's harder and harder to deny.
It reminds me of the Jerry Seinfeld joke that people are so afraid of public speaking that they'd rather be in the coffin than give the eulogy. You know, you'd rather be in the coffin than change your worldview, than change your opinion on how the world works. Last question for you, Tad. This is from Vincent St. Pierre, who asks, where can one buy Tom's book?
Well, at every good independent bookstore. I like that question. If you go to the commandinghope.com website, so commandinghope.com, Commanding Hope all run together, there's a buy the book button. You hit that and it gives you about 8 options for where you can buy the book, and it's available in as an audiobook and as an ebook, and also of course in hard copy. So delighted if people buy it. That was perfect. Makes the whole thing worthwhile.
Tad, thank you so much for this conversation. We've gone a bit over, but it was just too good of a conversation, and there's so much here to unpack, and I hope people buy your book and unpack it for themselves, because there's so much food for thought, but also so much hope in this. So thank you, Tad, so much for a wonderful chat.
Good. Thank you so much, Ben.
All right, Barbara, over to you.
And I want to thank both of you. Yes, it's everything that I hoped we could cram into a very short period of time. Although clearly we could listen to much more of this. There's so much more to be said. Thank you both. Extraordinary conversation. And yes, I will remind everyone once more, Thomas Homer-Dixon's books, including Commanding Hope, The Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril, are available for purchase at your local independents, such as Novel Idea in Kingston, or you can go online as Tad suggested. So thanks to Novel Idea, who's our official bookseller, to Knopf Canada, and thanks to all of you for joining us and for supporting Kingston Writers Fest. Be sure to check our website for dates and times and to register for more wonderful author events. Stay safe and well, and good night.